Good morning, it's Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects. It's Monday morning, April the 22nd, and it's Earth Day. So I hope as you go about your life in the next week or so, you think about ways that we can recycle and reuse and help make the world a better place for us all. Today I want to focus on projects that I call legacy projects. They're items that somebody else may have started, or work that somebody else may have envisioned that maybe they didn't have a chance to finish, and our hands and our ingenuity and maybe our creativity is able to help finish those projects. Before I get to looking at some of the items that I've worked on, and you've seen them there in the introductory film clip that's part of the video, I want to talk about an organization that's real important to me. It's called Loose Ends. And I know I've mentioned them before, but I want to talk just in a little more depth about them today. I find that I've kind of been drawn to these kind of projects, and I didn't really realize that until I was looking back, and I was able to identify almost a dozen projects that I've done through the years that have been continuations of something that somebody else has started. And one of my favorite writers talks about how when somebody starts a project, their very DNA, their very essence is a part of that project. Well, Loose Ends is a nonprofit. They're virtually located online. The two founders live in different parts of the country. And I just wanted to read a brief description of what they're about. When a crafter dies mid-project or is no longer able to do handwork due to disability or illness, they will likely have unfinished items they were making for friends and family. These tangible, handmade expressions of love could get lost, donated away, or thrown out. So the purpose of Loose Ends is to connect up folks with those who might be willing and able and have the skills to complete some of these beloved projects that might have begun. They can brag, I think now, in saying that there have been at least 22,000 finishes, and probably more than that have gone unreported, that Loose Ends has helped facilitate. They exist in 64 countries at least, as far as we know. 1,500 to 2,000 projects are submitted regularly. So if you're interested at all in this whole idea of legacy projects, and maybe you haven't run across anything that is interesting for you to work on, you might check out their website, Loose Ends. It's called the looseensproject.org is actually the web page, and see if you might want to volunteer. They do knitting, crochet, sewing, quilting, tatting, rug making, embroidery, cross-stitch, Tunisian crochet, mending, amigurumi, needlepoint, basketry, turkey work, felting, nail binding, applique, spinning, latch hook, punch needle, and weaving. So there's some things on there that I don't even know what they are. But I find this to be exciting, and I know the two young women that have been working on this project for some time are enthusiastic and loving, and if you have any skills and you might be interested, check out their project. So what I thought I would do today is talk about some that I have undertaken through the years. Again, I'm realizing now that I've kind of been drawn to this kind of project all along. When I started the idea of weaving, I didn't know what I was talking about. I just knew I wanted a big loom. We had a friend in our church named Sherry Banks who was an excellent weaver. Though I had never seen her weave, I knew that she loved it and was very excited about it. Sherry passed away with cancer, and her husband Terry loved her work very much and wanted to make sure that somebody would get a hold of her loom who knew something about it and at least would honor what Sherry had spent so much time doing. So we went over and bought the loom and all the stash that went with it from Terry. And lo and behold, there was a project on the loom already. Sherry had started a kind of a twill weaving project. Now, when I first got the loom, I didn't know anything about it, and I didn't know how to finish it. But after taking some lessons and learning a bit about it, I was able to come back, sit down at my wonderful 45-inch floor loom and complete a weaving project that Sherry had begun. It was a very simple project. As I say, it was twill, had off-white warp on the loom. I just simply picked some yarn, finished it up, and actually gave it to my daughter as a table runner. So I think that was the beginning, maybe, of my sense of taking on a project somebody else had begun. One of my favorite stories is a colleague of mine, Heather, had lost her mother a few years earlier. Her mother and Heather's daughters were very close. And somewhere along the line, as Heather and her father were cleaning out her mother's possessions, they found a little tabletop loom. Heather brought it back here to Florida from Michigan, and a few months later she called me and said, would you be willing to show us how to weave? My mother had this loom. My daughters loved my mother very much, and they think they'd like to learn how to weave. So she brought it in, and I was excited to see that the grandmother had actually started a weaving project on the loom. And for me, that was just kind of the best of all possible worlds, because Heather and the two girls could come in and they could begin anew the project that her mother had started. And so 3 generations of women finished out and wove a project that they could then use, and that would be a legacy of her mother's weaving style. So, I think those are just some of the fun kind of things that can happen. My sister-in-law, May's mother, was turning 90. And May's grandmother, Frances's mother, had been a great needle pointer. Her husband was a physician down in Martinsville, Virginia, and this was one of the things she loved to do. May found an unfinished piece. It was a petit-point of mushrooms, and you'll see it there in the pictures, with a vivid green background. All the yarns were there. It was all ready to be done. The background just needed to be stitched. So I pulled out the needle and did the old basket weave stitch and completed that, and May was able to give that to her mother as a pillow for her 90th birthday. So there's another kind of an example of those kind of wonderful things. A lady came into the shop a couple years ago. Her mother had loved making quilts, and she had loved stamped cross stitch, which is not something you see very much anymore. And the mother had done, I believe it was 16 squares of stamped cross stitch that would make a large quilt, a queen size quilt. The daughter, the one who brought it in to me, had begun working on the quilt. She had pieced all the pieces together, and she had finished any of the stamped cross stitch that her mother had not done. But she was afraid to have a long arm quilter look at it because she thought that might pull out some of the stitches. So she asked me if I would do the quilting. She layered it, brought it back in. I did the quilting for it over the course of probably about a year. Loved the experience of doing that hand quilting. I'm doing a hand quilt myself. If you follow any of my social media or have mentioned it on here, you know that it really helped me to get back into that idea of hand quilting and hand piecing. So there's yet another example of a legacy project. About 6 months ago, a lady came in here to the shop and said her neighbor was a great cross stitcher. She had begun this beautiful sea kind of themed afghan with seashells and all kinds of wonderful colors in it. The lady then began to develop dementia, and as she worked her way through the afghan, she got to a point where she couldn't remember how to do it anymore. But looking at the afghan and remembering how much joy it gave her made her very sad. It made her cry. So the neighbor said, would you and maybe some of the folks that you have there in the shop help us complete this afghan? because I think it will make my friend very happy. So my assistant, Barbara, and you see there a picture of her in the slideshow, and I worked on that Afghan and completed it for the lady, and we know that it brought her great comfort. It's just really cool to think that these skills that we use and that we love are something that can make somebody else very happy. I just want to say, I think a lot of time I hear folks say that they love stitching or they love weaving or they love knitting or whatever it may be, but nobody wants their stuff. Their kids have gotten all the projects they could ever handle. Isn't loose ends and isn't this idea of completing projects for somebody else a real nice way of filling in that gap for some of us who love to do fiber art, but maybe don't have any particular outlets for what we do anymore? Another project that I was very excited to undertake, it turned out to be quite difficult, but it was a lot of fun at the same time. St. James Episcopal Church here in Leesburg had a bishop's chair, and one of the cushions for the bishop's chair had gotten damaged and worn down through the years, and it was an example of gold work. Now, I can tell you that was the first and likely the last time I will ever do gold work. It's not my thing, and I realized very quickly that using the metallic threads was something that I did not enjoy, though some of you may love it. But I was able to pick out the parts of the gold work that were not up to standard. I talked to my friend Doug at Krynick Manufacturing, and he helped me replicate the kind of metallic threads that they had used. I even had to do some reconstruction at one point where I took little pieces of blank canvas and kind of stitched them onto the project so that I would have something to needlepoint on. But some loving person who was part of that church some years back had created that cushion to begin with, and I felt very honored. I felt like it was a great privilege for me to be able to finish something like that, especially something like that that's going to be used and loved and seen on a regular basis. By the way, I haven't forgotten my series on stitching and religious practice. I'll come back and do a couple more episodes of that, but I'll head it off in some other directions, as you can tell at this point. One of my favorite legacy projects was a huge cross stitch that I did of a Da Vinci portrait of the Madonna. A friend of mine from the Weavers Guild brought me a project one day. She said, my dear friend started stitching this. She was one of the best cross stitchers I've ever known. When she got sick and died, this kind of laid in a cabinet somewhere, and her husband asked me at one point if I could find somebody to finish it. I was quite thrilled to see the good work that she had done. She was one of those stitchers that was very meticulous. You could even tell by the way she had wrapped her threads around the bobbins that she was somebody that took great pride and great joy in doing cross stitch. And so finishing Madonna, framing it and sending it off to a friend of mine who lives in Texas was just a great joy. So that leads me to a current project that I'm working on, and that's kind of why I started thinking about this today. I have a project here in the shop that I'm doing, and this is going to be a Christmas stocking, and you can see that my friend Jerry designed and began the needlepoint work on this stocking. He has done these for various members of his family, and this was kind of the last one that he needed to get finished. And it was one that he had designed. He picked out the colors. You can see he has the outline in place, and a good bit of the needlepoint work has already been done. Jerry came in to see me last summer, and he told me about this project as well as a couple of other things that he would like to get done. And I could tell that he wasn't feeling well, and that maybe he had some pain and suffering. We talked about this project, but I didn't hear anything else from him for a while, and of course I hadn't seen it at the time. Just before the holidays this past year, he came in on one of the days when I wasn't in the shop, dropped the project off and said he really needed it done by Christmas. Well, that left me only a couple of weeks before Christmas, and with all the other things that I had going on at that time, there was no way I could do it. I called him. I was very sorry and very apologetic, but knew that I wouldn't be able to get it done in time for Christmas. And he was concerned that he had already put the date of 2023 on it. And I said, well, that can be fixed. I can take the 3 out and make it a 4 if we end up finishing it in 2024. Well, unfortunately, just a couple weeks after that conversation, Jerry passed away. He went into the hospital, developed pneumonia, and died very quickly. And relatively unexpectedly, even though he had been sick for quite some time. Well, I had the project here, and of course I felt terrible that I hadn't been able to finish it under the deadlines that we had been talking about. But his wife came in a few weeks later, and she said, I'd appreciate it if you would finish it anyway. It is beloved. It's one that this family member has been looking forward to. And of course, now that Jerry has passed away, it takes on even greater meaning. And as we talked, we realized we would leave the date of 2023 on the stocking. That was the time that Jerry had worked on the piece. That was at the end of that year, the time that Jerry had passed away. And it would give the stocking even greater meaning once it was finished. So I was just able to begin again, starting to work on this beautiful needlepoint stocking last week. And that's what made me think again about what joy these legacy projects bring. They're privileges for me to work on. I like the idea of furthering this work that we do and that we love and giving pleasure to somebody else. But I also do this project in memory of my friend Jerry and the good work that he did and the spirit of love and cooperation that he brought to the world. So I would commend to you looseensproject.org. If you have any interest in getting involved in some projects, sharing your skills, doing something that might bring comfort to someone else. And, I also would urge you to kind of take stock and think about the times in your stitching or weaving or knitting or whatever it is that you perhaps have done some of similar kind of projects. I'd love to hear about some of the stories that others have about the legacy projects that they have completed, because I think that's part of the heritage that this wonderful fiber art that we do suggests for us. So I'm going to end for today. I'll probably spend a little more time working on this needlepoint piece before I head out. And as always, it's a privilege to talk to you and hear your feedback. This is Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade.